This book is about what happened in Iraq over the last 4 years, how it happened and why it happened. I think that what sets it apart from most other books is that it really goes in depth into 03, 04 and a somewhat less depth on 05 and 06, early 06, which is really when this thing began to fall apart. 03, 04 is, I think, the key year. So here's the one reading I'm going to do. President George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq in 2003 ultimately became to be seen as one of the most profligate actions in the history of American foreign policy. The consequences of his choice won't be clear for decades, but it already is abundantly apparent that the U.S. government went to war in Iraq with scant solid international support and on the basis of incorrect information about weapons of mass destruction and a supposed nexus between Saddam Hussein's and al-Qaeda's terrorism, and then occupied the country negligently. Thousands of U.S. troops and an untold number of Iraqis have died. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent, many of them squandered. Democracy may yet come to Iraq and the region, but so too may civil war or a regional conflagration, which in turn could lead to spiraling oil prices and a global economic shock. This book's subtitle terms the U.S. effort in Iraq an adventure in the critical sense of adventurism. That is, the view that the U.S.-led invasion was launched recklessly with a flawed plan for war and a worse approach to occupation. Spooked by its own false conclusions about the threat, the Bush administration hurried its diplomacy, short-circuited its war planning, and assembled an agonizingly incompetent occupation. None of this was inevitable. It was made possible only through the intellectual acrobatics of simultaneously worst-casing the threat presented by Iraq, while best-casing the subsequent cost and difficulty of occupying the country. How the U.S. government could launch a preemptive war based on false premises is the subject of the first part of this book. Blame must lie foremost with President Bush himself, but his incompetence and arrogance are only part of this story. It takes more than one person to make a mess as big as Iraq. That is, Bush could only take such a careless action because of a series of failures in the American system. Major lapses occurred within the National Security Bureaucracy, from a weak National Security Council to an overweening Pentagon and a confused intelligence apparatus. Larger failures of oversight occurred in the political system, most notably in Congress, and in the inability of the media to find and present alternate sources of information about Iraq and the threat that it did or did not present to the United States. It is a tragedy in which every major player contributed to the errors, but in which the heroes tend to be anonymous and relatively powerless. The frontline soldier doing his best in a difficult situation, the Iraqi civilian trying to care for a family amid chaos and violence. They are the people who pay every day with blood and tears for the failures of high officials and powerful institutions. The basic theme of this book and of my talk today is that the American system didn't work. And I think this is really important to bring home to the majority of you, students, because since 9/11, the American system, I don't think, has worked particularly well, has not worked as the Founding Fathers intended. So what you have seen during most of your conscious lives, assuming you sort of become consciously aware of the world out there around age 13 or 14, for what you have seen during your conscious life is not the American system working. It is an aberration from the American system. What I want to give you today is in many ways a profoundly small c conservative call for a return to traditional American values. Okay, 5 basic failures in this systemic breakdown. Each of them involving the failure of a major American institution, and usually as a departure from American tradition. The first one is well known, that is the mistakes of the Bush administration, some of them wars. The 2 departures from tradition I want to focus on quickly here are the Bush administration's Middle East policy and its handling of the run-up to the war. The Middle East policy of the Bush administration essentially overturned 50 years of American policy. Since the United States really had a policy, which is about since 1945, when FDR met with the Saudi leadership aboard the USS Quincy. The goal of U.S. policy had been, in the Middle East, stability, even at the expense of supporting authoritarian or dictatorly regimes. After 9/11, stability was no longer the goal of U.S. policy in the Middle East. It was the target. The second big departure was the narrowness, the exclusive way in which the Bush administration went to war. A terrifically exclusionary approach inside the government and also politically. The most famous example of this, of course, is General Shinseki, the Army Chief of Staff, who, when he testified before Congress that he thought many more troops were needed to occupy the country, was publicly slapped down by Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz and by others, and essentially put in the icebox for over a year until his retirement as Army Chief of Staff. But the exclusionary approach went well beyond that. One of the people I interviewed for the book was a senior military intelligence officer who took home Annex Bravo to the war plan one weekend. Annex Bravo in U.S. terminology is the intelligence appendix to a war plan. He took it home, read it, came back to the Pentagon on Monday with a series of problems, especially discrepancies between known intelligence and the target sets listed. He was thanked for his interest in national defense and not invited back to future meetings. Similarly, Representative Ike Skelton was alienated by the White House. Now, he is a classic conservative Democrat, Harry Truman type from rural Missouri. Exactly the type of person that typically you would want to bring inside the tent if you're a Republican administration going to war. When he sent a letter to the White House, in fact, a series of letters, raising concerns about the occupation, have you considered that this would be the first ever American occupation of an Arab country? How long do you think that will take? How much do you think it might cost? The response he got from a White House aide, and I am quoting, was, "Mr. Congressman, we don't need your vote." This was a departure from the American tradition of the big tent, of pulling people in. For example, remember Franklin Roosevelt, as president, had Henry Stimson, a Republican, as his Secretary of War. And it's interesting that the two people who have ever been Secretary or Defense twice were Stimson and Rumsfeld. But Stimson was brought in by the opposite party. Rumsfeld was brought in by his own party. The result of this exclusionary approach, I would argue, was a really lousy war plan. It was more a plan for battle than for war. It focused 90% of its time and energy, the staffs involved, on the smaller problem of getting to Baghdad, and almost none of its time and energy on the much bigger question, what do I do once I get there? The second major institutional failure was that of the intelligence agencies. The surprise to me in doing my research, I read 37,000 pages of documents in the course of writing the book. The surprise to me was the frontline analysis, the work done by the guys in the trenches in the intelligence world, was actually pretty good. They put their finger on the questions, on the problems. But as the information went its way up the pachinko system of the intelligence bureaucracy, it systematically got skewed in one direction. Anything that supported the Bush administration's perceived policy was overemphasized. Anything that undercut Bush administration policy was neglected, downplayed, or thrown out altogether. This happened in the past. I would argue it was more extreme in this case, and it wound up by not presenting an honest product. I would blame this primarily on George Tenet and on people at the White House who kind of knew what was going on and liked it. The result I do want to notice, though, is what they did to Colin Powell. Remember, in February 2003, they sent Colin Powell up to give a speech at the United Nations. We now know that the speech he presented was almost entirely false in every one of its particulars. Here's a man who had served his country honorably for decades, who had been National Security Advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Secretary of State, and they played him like a chump. Third, journalism. Journalism failed during the run-up to the war. At its best, we failed. Stories that should have been on A1 went on A23. Stuff that should have been at the top of the story was at the bottom of the story. I still kick myself when I think back to a story I wrote just before the beginning of the war. I interviewed the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Jim Myers, and I said to him, "You don't really know where the supposed weapons of mass destruction are, do you?" And he said, "No, but I'm confident the Iraqis will show us as soon as we cross the border. I regret to say I did publish this, but it was in the last paragraph of the story I wrote. Why? Because war seemed inevitable at the time. Because I've been writing this stuff for a year, and nobody seemed to be paying attention. They don't know where the WMD is. And so I just chucked into the story just to make sure at least I got it in the paper. At its worst, journalism intensified the first two institutional failures, most notably in the work of Judith Miller of the New York Times, who accelerated the drive to war. My favorite point is when she quotes Richard Pearl in support of the credibility of Ahmed Chalabi. I mean, that's the trifecta. Judith Miller quoting Richard Pearl on Ahmed Chalabi's credibility. Congress. I think this is a very important one to pay attention to. One of my disappointments in writing Fiasco is I thought and still think that Congress was the villain of the book more than the Bush administration. The Bush administration did what it thought was best. Congress simply didn't do anything. It abdicated its oversight responsibility. It basically went to sleep. What I say in the book is, in other words, with hawks and doves, in this war you were the silence of the lambs. We were 4 years into this war before we started having hearings on the conduct of the war. Now, you might ask, should Congress be questioning the conduct of the war as it's going on? Should they line up behind the Commander-in-Chief? Well, the answer is it's American tradition for the Congress to be actively involve itself in the conduct of war. During the Civil War, there was a committee on the conduct of the war so intrusive it antagonized President Lincoln. During World War II, Harry Truman made his name as a senator by holding hearings on defense contracting. A Democratic senator holding hearings about what a Democratic administration was doing in the conduct of the war. Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson held hearings on the conduct of the Korean War as it was underway. And most famously, Senator Fulbright held hearings on Vietnam as the war was underway. Congress here departed from an American tradition. For several years did not ask basic questions about the conduct of the war. I once asked Representative Skelton why no division commanders had ever been called to testify before Congress. He said he had asked the chairman of the committee to hold such a hearing. The chairman had agreed, and they sent the request over to the Pentagon, and Secretary Rumsfeld had said no. The reason this is so worrisome is it went on for several years. We had been involved fighting in Iraq longer than we were involved in World War II before Congress started asking basic questions about the war. Why is this bad? For a couple of reasons. First, it failed to inform Congress itself, and that's one reason their debates, I think, have seemed so irrelevant. They have no factual basis on which to stand. They're simply throwing opinions back and forth at each other. Second, hearings would inform the American people. I wrote Fiasco basically to try to answer the questions that I thought Congress should have been answering, but wasn't. Third, and this is something that people don't notice as much, when Congress doesn't do its job as a co-equal branch of government, it lessens military effectiveness. Now, it may seem intrusive to be hauling generals up in front of the Congress in the middle of a war, but it actually can be very helpful. Because when the generals don't ask themselves the tough questions, it's the role of Congress to do so. And here we have a war where, again, in a departure from American tradition, generals have not been asking themselves the tough questions. Can anybody tell me how many generals have been relieved in this war? Any bets, take a guess?
None.
None with an asterisk, or maybe one, because Janice Karpinski, the reserve brigadier general who was in charge of the Abu Ghraib prison, was demoted to colonel, but it's not clear whether that was for shoplifting or for Abu Ghraib. But this is a real departure from American tradition. During the Civil War, Lincoln buzzed through generals until he found himself a winner named Grant. During World War II, generals were relieved frequently. In fact, Harry D. La Mesa Allen was relieved after defeating the Germans in the middle of Sicily. Why? Because Omar Bradley didn't entirely like the way he was operating. Now, Harry D. Mesa Allen was relieved and later given a division after he got his act back together. He commanded 2 divisions during the war. But here, generals have basically made themselves a club that isn't criticized politically or internally. The Army has a great lessons learned system. It's terrific. I've read tens of thousands of pages of documents, and you can really learn a lot from their internal lessons learned process. I have never read one criticism, though, of a general in the lessons learned process. One reason may be that a colonel is in charge of the lessons learned office. I think the failure of the military establishment has not been generally recognized in this country, even inside the military. Our troops were put into Iraq untrained, not just unequipped, but untrained for the task at hand. And the generals didn't do what Clausewitz says is the basic task of the top commander. Clausewitz is the great Prussian philosopher of war, says that the supreme task, and in fact the only task of the top commander, is to recognize the nature of the conflict in which he is engaged. And our generals didn't. They didn't recognize an insurgency that was rising up. They kept on calling them former regime elements, a few dead enders. And they engaged in rash and uncautious, unwise optimism again and again. The U.S. Army's official war plan for Iraq called for us to be down to 30,000 troops by September 2003. Here we are 4 years later, still bobbing along around 140,000. One result of this is that troops were put into situations that they couldn't handle. A good example of this is the 1st Armored Division, a unit I was embedded with in May 2003. Later that summer, some guys from the 1st AD were told in downtown Baghdad to deter looters. Now, they did not begin given any training in this. They decided the way to deter looters was to make them cry. You won't find that in any Army field manual, any textbook on counterinsurgency, but they were improvised. So one day, these guys from the 1st AD catch 2 teenage boys looting along with the boy's father. And they say to the father, "Which of your sons do you want us to shoot?" These were American troops. And I'm quoting here from investigatory documents, internal Army affidavits. "Which of your boys do you want us to shoot?" The father says, as many would, "No, please shoot me instead." "You don't get that choice," the soldiers say. They take one of the teenage boys around to the other side of a truck, they take out a weapon, and they fire it past the boy's head. Then they let the 3 of them go, presumably deterred, probably terrified and crying. Also, almost certainly less pro-American they were than they had been at the beginning. So there you have a good example of soldiers trying to execute the tactical mission, but undercutting the strategic goal. I really don't blame the soldiers who did that. What they did was wrong. But what I blame is the system that put them there, especially the generals who let them be put in that position. Generals themselves were directly responsible also for helping inflame the insurgency by using counterproductive tactics. For example, some generals were told, get your area quiet, get your AO, your area of operations, quiet. The 4th Infantry Division decided the way to do this was to scoop up all the military-aged males and ship them out of their area. Bingo, it's quiet. He's achieved his mission. Well, where'd the guys go? Not his problem. Well, I'll tell you where they went. They went to detention facilities like Abu Ghraib. Frequently were held for as long as 90 days without their families being told where they were. And the prison population wasn't segregated by its politics. So hardcore, frothing at the mouth al-Qaeda terrorist is put in cheek by jowl with Amr Jacqueline, the farmer who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. They call this, in the military, Mooj University. Because the farmer, probably less pro-American than when he went in, emerges 90 days later, probably schooled and had properly in place an IED by the side of the road. The military, I don't think, has honestly examined the leadership failure that occurred in Iraq. I think some individuals have. I think the work that General Petraeus did at Fort Leavenworth for the last couple of years really established a record of what to do and what not to do. Now, as the top commander in Iraq is going out and implementing some of that stuff. But not the military establishment, okay. Not the generals club. At the outset of World War II, George Marshall relieved about 200 senior officers in the U.S. Army. Not because they were unpatriotic, not because they were bad men, not even because they were necessarily incompetent, simply because he thought they weren't the right men for the job at the time. In this war, not a single general has been relieved for poor performance in the field. In fact, we don't criticize generals. And the political system doesn't either. I think it's one reason for this is the Democratic Party has confused generals with troops. They think that if you criticize generals, you're not supporting the troops. Anybody who spends time with the troops knows that one way to support the troops is to criticize the generals, especially if you want your military to be effective. Some of the questions that might have been asked of the generals and of the Congress include these. How much does the war cost? I cover this thing every day, and I can't tell you. I can give you a pretty good guess, $2 billion a week, maybe 2.1. But don't worry about it. My generation's not paying for it. Yours is. Right now, it's being funded by basically borrowing from the Chinese, U.S. government borrowing, settling bonds with the Chinese. So the rest of you, for the rest of your lives, will probably be contributing about $1,000 or $2,000 a year for your working lives to pay for this thing. So, thank you. I can't tell you what the war cost. Is the strategy adequately funded and people? The first time I ran into a U.S. advisor of an Iraqi unit in the Green Zone, I asked him, why are you doing this? And he said, I was unemployed in Iowa. This is not a system that's putting the best and the brightest out there when its unemployed reservists are being given the most important task in Iraq, which is training and advising Iraqi forces. The last time I worked, 40% of the people involved in the training and advising effort were reservists. Now, reservists are hard working, but they're not going to be 18 guys, generally. Why was that? Why couldn't we send the best? What's the relationship between command in Iraq and subsequent positions? H.R. McMaster was found in an internal Army study to be the most effective brigade or regimental commander in Iraq in 2005-2006. What did they do with McMaster? They sent him to a think tank in England. It's as if, like, General Patton, great job you did there in Sicily, but now you need to go to the War College. And I actually just came from doing a staff ride study in Sicily of the U.S. campaign in World War II, so it's a lot on my mind. We rotate out all our commanders after a year there, with the exception of a couple of top people. It's as if, after Sicily, they took Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, Lucente, Truscott, and said, guys, it's somebody else's turn now. You go back to Washington, take a job in the Pentagon. We're going to put in another team. If we had done that in World War II, likely a year later, D-Day would have failed in Normandy. Because our commanders made a lot of necessary mistakes in Sicily that they learned from. They learned major lessons. Eisenhower learned how to be a supreme commander as he watched many of the failures in Sicily. Bradley learned how to run generals. Patton learned how to be a nut. But we kept them in there, and they did D-Day marvelously a year later. Here, we would add another team in, and I think that's one reason that we rolled the rock up the hill in Iraq and had it roll down every year. And as a new team comes in. When I ask guys in the Pentagon, why is this? They say, well, would it be fair to the other guys not to give them a chance at command? Honestly, I don't really care about being fair to generals. I would like to see our military be effective, even if some guys don't get their chance for a bite of the apple. That leads to another question of mine. Iraq is an intensely relational society. The relationship is key. Yet we have a rotational military. I don't think you can win in a relational society with a rotational military. It would be nice if Congress held hearings on this. I don't want to be entirely negative, so I want to end by talking about some good examples of adjustment that I saw in the military. Some commanders have done extremely well. In the Marines, General Mattis. In the Army, General Petraeus. In 2003-2004, when he had the 101st Airborne Division up in Mosul, was extremely effective, understood what he was doing. H.R. McMaster, commander of the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, last year in Califar, did a terrific job. It was really a textbook study of how to operate intelligently, patiently, and ultimately effectively. McMaster, it was particularly impressive because he took a unit that at best had a mediocre first tour in Iraq. The 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in its first tour in Iraq was put in a difficult situation. They were given basically most of Anbar province for a relatively small unit. And they had an Iraqi general turn himself in for questioning. He was beaten to death with interrogation. This is not a classic offensive interrogation technique, no matter what you see on a TV show 24. They had a captain who carried a baseball bat. He called his Iraqi gear, and he used it. They had a bunch of soldiers up on the Syrian border who are alleged to have routinely robbed people coming into Iraq. Now, Iraq is a cash economy, basically, so people will bring in large amounts of cash. I say allegedly because nobody investigated the allegations for a year. And of course, a year later, where are you going to find the witnesses? The evidence was gone. So H.R. McMaster takes over the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. It was then based in Fort Carson, Colorado. And he goes around and looks each of the subordinate formations in the eye. And he says, every time you disrespect an Iraqi, you are working for the enemy. People say counterinsurgency is a big fancy doctrine, you know, a $10 word. That's counterinsurgency expressed in a way any 19-year-old infantryman can get. Got it, sure. Sir, I disrespect Iraqis, my buddy gets killed. I'm not going to do it. McMaster also followed his words with actions. When he went out to Iraq, he started a new function in his regiment. There was a department called Ask the Customer. Anybody know who the customer was? Iraqi detainees. All Iraqi detainees, upon being released by his unit, were asked in a non-threatening and honest way, not by their captors, but by another officer, how are you treated, and do you have any complaints? And then 1 in 10 was given an in-depth sensing session on his politics. What makes you anti-American? How could we operate differently in your village? Is there anything we could do to make your village less anti-American? And then H.R. McMaster took something that I think showed genuine audacity. He went to the insurgent leaders in his area and he apologized. Can you imagine that? An American officer goes to the local tribal leaders affiliated, the clerics affiliated with the insurgency, and he apologizes. And this is what he says. When the Americans first came to Iraq, we were like men stumbling around a dark room. We stepped on a lot of toes, and we broke some furniture. But now there's an Iraqi government that has turned on the light switch, and we can see better. And the time for honorable resistance has ended. Now, he's expressed this in Iraqi terms. The core values of Iraqi society, honor, dignity, and respect, which I think resonate in the Iraqi ear as liberty and freedom do in ours, as our core values. But if you translate in American what he said, it's basically the most polite death threat you'll ever hear. He has said, hey, I know who you guys are, I know what you're doing, and if you keep it up, I have the means to kill you. But he's expressed it in ways that I think really stun the Iraqis. This guy gets us, he understands us. And he took back Talafar from a particularly gruesome group of terrorists. And he did it over the course of 6 months, slowly, patiently, and carefully. Now, the end of the story, unfortunately, as I said, is his unit rotated home. He was sent off to a think tank in London, and Talafar fell apart. In the last few days, Talafar suffered the worst single truck bombing, car bombing, we've seen in Iraq. And the local police, Shiite police imported in the area, responded by going on a rampage in city neighborhoods and shooting people. So Talafar, fortunately, has gone from being the example of the best we can do, of clearing, holding, and securing an area, to the worst we can do, which is providing the weaponry with which one sect begins to kill another sect. Effectively, we have poured gasoline on the sectarian fire. Finally, where are we now? What should we do besides head to the basement? I'm going to tell you, I don't have any good answers, and I don't think there are any good answers now. My best bet is we are not going to wind up either staying or going, but rather moving back, almost stepping backward into a stance of containment, trying to keep this civil war from becoming a regional war. But that's just a guess. What can you do? I think the first thing you can do is demand more of your own leaders and officials. Demand that the system work. Demand that they do more than just throw rhetoric back and forth at each other. Ask them to get their facts and speak from a factual basis. Personally, I think the best thing we can all do to deal with Iraq right now is to understand that it is a tragedy. The nature of tragedy is that there are no good answers. And you have to begin sorting through what is the least bad answer. I think every solution I've heard carries a significant downside to it. So the question is, what is the least worst of all the options before us? Remember also that in Shakespeare, tragedies come in 5 acts. And I think we're only in Act 3, the Atreus years. Act 4 will be in some form the American drawdown. And I think Act 5 will be the regional consequences. But I think this will go on for years and years and years. When I was writing Fiasco, I looked sometimes out the window at 3:30, and these group of kindergartners would be marching up the hill from the elementary school near my house to the daycare center on the other side of my house. And I would think in my pessimistic moments that one of those kids is going to fight and die in Iraq. And I still think that's quite possible. I think we're going to have troops there for a long time in a diminished size. But I'll tell you, I don't think it is going to end as we like it. It's going to end like Macbeth, or Othello, or King Lear, or Hamlet, which is to say, it's going to be bloody. Thank you. Now I'd like to get to your questions. You can see why John Stewart called me Little Miss Sunshine.
Would you just reflect briefly on what the role of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has been across the entire time of the war, and let us know if there's any contrast between the years when General Myers was the chairman, General Pace the chairman, or any contrast between when Rumsfeld was the secretary and since Rumsfeld has left.
Did you all hear the question up there? By the way, that was Professor Andy Basovich, who's the reason I'm here today. He sent me a request that I come and do this, and he's been a real mentor for me over the last 15 years, teaching me a lot about the military. And when he sent me a note, there's about 2 or 3 people I do this for, he's one of them, but he's been terrific. His question was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What role have they played? And have there been changes under General Myers, predecessor, or now General Pace, the current chairman? One of the oddities of reporting my book was figuring out that I needed to look at the holes as well as the donut. And one of the holes is there doesn't seem to have been any presidential decision to go to war. No cabinet. It just sort of happened by osmosis. As best I can make out, the decision to go to war was really made by Vice President Dick Cheney on August 26, 2002, when he got up to the Foreign Wars Convention in Nashville, Tennessee, and said, I'm quoting, "There is no doubt about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction." And the signal went out across the government, okay, there's no doubt, that means we're going to war. I'm told that that speech was actually an interesting use of the preemptive doctrine. He basically used that to cut off the internal debate inside the Bush administration to shut down Colin Powell's attempts to talk Bush in off the ledge, and basically just push the administration towards a war footing, and that can happen. Likewise, the Joint Chiefs of Staff hardly show up in all this. One of the pesky questions I ask generals is, since the fall of Baghdad, have the Joint Chiefs of Staff considered Iraq strategy? And I was told they never did under General Myers. They were never asked, what's your opinion of our strategy in Iraq? The Joint Chiefs of Staff is going to be kind of interesting now, though, because General Conway, the Marine Commandant, a member of the Joint Chiefs, and General Casey, who takes over next week as the Army Chief of Staff, are both Iraq veterans. So for the first time, we're going to have the 2 most important voices, because the ground forces are basically fighting the Iraq War. The leader of the Marine Corps and the leader of the Army will both be speaking from on-the-ground experience in Iraq. And also, as Professor Basovich pointed to, we have a new Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, since December, who is, first of all, extremely focused on Iraq. He told people on Capitol Hill he has 3 priorities, Iraq, Iraq, and Iraq. And also is very open to listening to people. I've actually appeared before Gates when he was a member of the Iraq Study Group. What I was struck by was the questions he asked me were extremely good and also extremely neutral. He plays his cards close to his chest. I couldn't tell where he was going with the questions, or he wasn't trying to push me towards any conclusion. He wanted to know, what did I think about this, or what had happened in this situation. So I think it's going to be very interesting, the interaction. I think that Gates will push the Joint Chiefs to actually perform their advisory role to the President in a way that Rumsfeld didn't want them to, and kind of cut them out of. Another thing that's going to empower the Joint Chiefs is that the new head of Central Command is a Navy Admiral, Fallon, and he simply doesn't have the ground war experience. So I think he's almost going to be, he'll be listened to, but he's not going to carry the weight that General Petraeus will as the 4-star commander on the ground in Iraq, or that the Conway and Casey, the two guys in the Joint Chiefs, will. Any other questions? Yes, please.
I heard you say on the radio on the Al Franken show back in February that there's a scenario in which I think you said Saudi money would go against Shia bodies. And I'm wondering how you view the interests of Saudi Arabia, especially after King Abdullah seemed to have bailed on us last week, and Iran's in this hostage situation seems to be provoking Britain. What are their interests in this conflict?
It's a good question. What's the Saudi role at this point? Where are they going? I was actually quoting a very good British analyst, Toby Dodge, of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Dodge predicts that ultimately what you're going to see in Iraq is a regional civil war fought in the streets of Baghdad. It, as he said, pits Saudi money against Shiite bodies. And he said the war won't necessarily spill over into the rest of the region, but the rest of the region will spill into Iraq. You're already seeing that to a degree. Iran is very active inside Iraq. And if the Sunnis appear to become an endangered species, which I think is increasingly likely, you're going to see much more support from the Sunni world. And remember, the Sunni world is the large majority of the Middle Eastern Muslim world. That appears to be the direction we're going in. What you have right now is a Shiite government that, instead of moving toward political reconciliation, appears to be becoming more and more sort of hardcore Shiite, with Sunni members bailing out. My gut feeling on the Shiite government is they essentially feel they have won the war. And they're keeping Uncle Sam around as a useful chum while they consolidate their hold on Iraq and also settle out their internal differences. And also, I think they're kind of waiting for Sistani to die. I call it Sistani, because he's still a moderating force, a force that pulls them a little bit back from political involvement. Once he's gone, Muqtada al-Sadr, who was kind of like Al Sharpton with heavy weapons, Muqtada al-Sadr becomes the ruler of the new Iraq. Any other questions? Please.
Forgive me if this question is very broad. It seems that there are a lot of parallels between World War II Nazism and the current Islamic radicalism that we've been seeing. To what extent do you believe that the Bush administration is trying to contain it, and if so, was the invasion of Iraq the most direct route of doing this, and if it's not, what could have been done differently?
My alternate universe where we did things right. When the invasion of Iraq was first being considered, General Jack Keeney, then the Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, the #2 guy in the Army, said in the tent where the Joint Chiefs discussed things, he said, don't do Iraq, keep your eye on the ball. Al-Qaeda did 9/11, Al-Qaeda had Afghanistan, and we knocked them out, and now they're holed up along the Afghan-Pakistani border. His recommendation was to keep 2 U.S. Army divisions on the Afghan-Pakistani border until we had Al-Qaeda totally shut down. The general feeling among a lot of people in the Army was that invading Iraq was not part of the war on terror, it was a distraction from the war on terror. One of the things I reported in my book, and it hasn't gotten much attention, I don't know why, was that so many officers at the combatant commands, which is the top U.S. military commands around the world, so many of the planners in the J5 directorates were questioning invading Iraq, that finally the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Myers, issued a directive in November 2002, saying you will consider any invasion of Iraq to be part of the war on terror. And that had the force of an order. Because so many people in the military were saying that's crazy. Iraq's got nothing to do with it. The feeling in the Army generally was the containment of Iraq was working. Iraq had nothing to do with Islamic terrorism. I mean, how many 9/11 hijackers came from Iraq? No, they came from Saudi Arabia. Yes, there was a problem with Islamic terrorism. Iraq was not part of that problem. Was Iraq the biggest threat in the neighborhood? No, Iran probably was and still is. So we took our eye off the ball of the war on terror. We hit the wrong target. We walked in and squandered thousands of lives, hundreds of millions of dollars, and much credibility. And we advanced the agenda of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. What are Al-Qaeda's goals? Al-Qaeda's goals are to topple the Saudi Arabian regime and to get control of nuclear weapons. I would submit that because of the fallout in Iraq, Al-Qaeda is now closer to both those goals than it was before the invasion of Iraq. One of the things I would love to do is take some of that money we're spending on Iraq, $2 billion a week. Do you know what $2 billion would do for aid in the Pakistani high school system? 1 week of spending in Iraq. Even with no strings attached. If some of it's going to go wrong, if some of it's going to be corrupt, if some of it's even going to wind up in the hands of terrorists. I don't care. I think the Pakistani people would have said, wow, Uncle Sam really means it. He's giving us $2 billion. He wants us, sure, to study democracy and stuff, but he basically said, no strings attached, improve your educational system. That would have been so much more effective. I was really struck when I was in Italy. I was in Sicily, which is a fairly remote part of Italy. There's all these posters up for a play about Guantanamo. That is what the United States has come to be associated with. I was talking to a friend of mine in the military who had recommended shutting down Guantanamo. She's a legal officer, and I said, why? She said, because you can't win a war for your values by undermining them. And then she began to cry. Any other questions?
Why would you say that the most recent Iraq study group has been pretty much disregarded completely by the Bush administration?
Disregarded by what?
The Bush administration.
I don't know, this gets deep into the psychology. The question was, why is the Iraq study group's report been ignored by the Bush administration? I've always thought in many ways that Bush operated in opposition to his father. He wanted to be seen as an inheritor of Reagan, not of Daddy. And so having Daddy's best friend run this thing probably was a political mistake. That said, I think it put the Bush administration in a terrifically difficult position, which is here's this bipartisan commission unanimously recommending a series of things. And I think actually we're going to come out surprisingly close to what the Iraq study group recommended, but our political system is going to have to, walk backwards into those conclusions. It's going to take many months. I do think by this fall, which is Ramadan, from mid-September to mid-October, I think we'll have a good idea of the future of Iraq, where it's going. And I think U.S. policy will very much move in the direction of the Iraq study group. This can take several months, the politics to play out here, and for the U.S. military operations on the ground to play out on the ground in Iraq. But I think the same reason also is why I think the current debate in Congress is almost irrelevant, which is they're talking about 2008. Talking about 2008 in Iraq is like talking about next century. A lot of Iraqis don't want to be alive, especially if they're in this government. So when I hear the Congress and the White House debating about what should we do in 2008 in Iraq, it's like watching ants floating on a log down a river, discussing which way the log should go. It's going to go down the river. No matter how many ants are on the log, whether you put another 21,000 ants on the log, it's going down the river. In many ways, we've lost control of events. We lost the initiative years ago. We've always been 6 to 12 months, our government has, in assessing and understanding the situation on the ground. And I think probably that's still where we're at, is somewhat behind the curve. Did that answer your question? Good.
You addressed the lack of international support earlier, and I was just wondering, do you feel that this is going to continue over the next few years, or the United States is going to have to start bending its policies to start getting some other countries on board with things?
Sure. The question is, I didn't hear it upstairs, was international support. Are we going to see more? Will the United States start changing its policies to win more international support? Right now, international support is astonishingly low. Even some of our allies, if you talk to them privately, are extremely unhappy. And people we considered kind of supporters, like the Saudi Arabians, are becoming more and more outspoken in their unhappiness with the direction in Iraq. I think this is likely to continue during the Bush administration. But the next president, no matter who he or she is and which party he or she is from, I think is going to have an enormous opportunity. Because all these other countries, especially allies, are going to want to demonstrate to us, we weren't anti-American, we were just anti-Bush. Now that you got rid of that cowboy, now we're willing to support you. So there'll be about a 12-month window of support where the new president can reach out and say, look, we want to get this right. Will you help us out? But I don't think it's going to go that far, the support. A lot of people have this dream that somehow we can internationalize the effort in Iraq. We could get an Arab force in or a UN force in. It ain't going to happen. There's not enough Arab countries that want to help us out there in our goals. The UN has been repeatedly burned in Iraq by events there. Remember the bombing of UN headquarters in Baghdad in August 2003, which was horrible for the UN, is remembered as that organization's 9/11. So I don't think you're going to see an internationalization of the military effort in any meaningful way. Basically, the coalition continues to shrink. The last time I counted the coalition, the majority of members of the coalition were actually from the Warsaw Pact countries. And most of them didn't exist, or many of them didn't exist during the 1991 war because, for example, the Czech Republic and Slovakia were then a different country. We are basically on the hook for this, no matter how it comes out. We're not going to get bailed out by the international community. You're keeping track of time, everyone.
I'll take one more.
So you talk a lot about the upper level management of political appointees and military officers, but how much dissent has there been among lower and mid-level officers in the military?
The question, in case you didn't hear it, was I talked a lot about upper level officers, colonels and generals. But the tone of the question was almost, what about the people who actually know what's going on? What about the soldiers on the ground? There has been surprisingly little dissent from soldiers on the ground. You hear some grumbling at the margins. The Internal Army Survey, conducted by Walter Reed, for example, found extreme unhappiness with battalion commanders in Iraq. 72% said their battalion commanders were poor or worse. I think that's actually not because they were poor battalion commanders, but because they were the people who represented policy and reality to the soldiers below them. He's the guy who comes out and says, guess what, we just got extended for 90 days. I think that would be unhappy with battalion commanders. One of the surprises to me about the U.S. military in Iraq has been how cohesive it remains more than 4 years into this thing. I would not have predicted it. If you had submitted, if you put the U.S. military through this grind it's been through in Iraq, 12 months, maybe 18 months out there, come back, get a month leave, and then spend a year ramping up to get back out there, bring in a bunch of new soldiers, newbies out of boot camp, train them up, get your act together, patch your marriage up, get to know your kids again so at least they recognize you, and then head back out for another year into one of the world's most difficult climates in an extremely alien culture. I would have predicted to you the U.S. military would be in worse shape. I think the reason it isn't is because we have this relatively small, extremely professional, cohesive, all-volunteer force. All these people asked to be in the Army or the Marine Corps. They're all well-trained. It's very common when you go out now with an infantry squad that almost all the guys, except the guys who are brand new out of boot camp, are wearing a combat patch, which means they've had a previous combat tour. It's probably the most seasoned Army we've ever had. On the other hand, there's a real worry about the third tour. The British will tell you that the third tour is what broke the British military in North America. We're seeing some very worrisome signs right now as the Army comes into its third year-long tour. Recruiting remains pretty good, except that standards are coming down pretty quickly. Re-enlistment, called retention, looks pretty good overall, but the key indicator that worries me is I'm told in the most recent year they fell well below target for re-enlistment of sergeants, mid-career sergeants, NCOs. They came in at 80% of their goal. When your mid-career sergeant starts leaving, that's the canary in the coal mine. The U.S. military is built around the backbone of the seasoned, well-trained, competent sergeant. And when he starts bailing out, the guy at 8 to 12 years who says, I'm not going to make a career of this, That's extremely worrisome. So it's one of the signs that we're watching pretty closely. It's getting harder and harder to get the information out of the Pentagon on this thing. Thank you all very much.